And now for something a little different. We have a group presentation, and the group is the Gamecock Flag Association, founded in 2024. It's a student organization at the University of South Carolina, and it is the newest regional studies flag group affiliated with NAVA. You can find a full case study on how the Gamecock Flag Association began and developed on the NAVA website. And this case study can serve as a guide to any members that are hoping to create another local association. Zachary Gardiner is the president of the Gamecock Flag Association and a junior at the university. He's been a member of NAVA since 2021, and he won the Driver Award in 2023 at NAVA 57. And the Gamecock Flag Association has been very active in outreach among its student community, and one result of that energy is the paper and group presentation we will hear today.
All right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Zachary Gardiner.
Well, I am Will Gross.
I'm Tarun Ramkumar.
I'm Owen Coulam.
And I'm Dustin King.
As was mentioned, we are all students at the University of South Carolina. We're here representing the Gamecock Flag Association there. And although we are the entire country away from South Carolina, we figured it would be most relevant to give a presentation about our state flag. And so, without further ado, we will be exploring the existence of the word liberty on the South Carolina Moultrie flag. First, a bit of an introduction. So, the flag of South Carolina was first adopted in January of 1861. It was adopted right before the outbreak of the Civil War, following South Carolina's Declaration of Secession. And they did this because they wanted to have a sort of national flag in order to represent their vessels at sea. And so they adopted this flag. However, some people don't realize is that the emblems and the symbols on the flag of South Carolina actually trace back to the Revolutionary War. So the earliest sort of design of the South Carolina flag, which could be seen, was first created by South Carolinian Revolutionary War leader Colonel William Moultrie. And this was done after taking possession of the British-held Fort Johnson in 1775 during the Revolutionary War. And he designed this flag to match the uniform of his troops. So his troops were clothed in blue, and they had silver crescents on their caps. And so he decided to design a flag which had a blue field and in its dexter corner, a silver crescent. So why is this flag so important in South Carolina history? Well, there is a famous battle called the Battle of Sullivan's Island during the Revolutionary War, where American patriots helped to defeat a British naval fleet, which was going to attack and invade Charleston. And while they were doing this at Fort Sullivan, later called Fort Moultrie, they flew this flag above the fort. It was famously shot down and retrieved by Sergeant William Jasper in a heroic act, and is remembered in history textbooks in South Carolina today. However, Colonel William Moultrie's description of this flag in his memoirs is not the only description which can be found in history. One other description was made by William Henry Drayton, who was another South Carolinian Revolutionary War leader. And in his description, he also adds the detail that the word liberty was featured on this early South Carolina flag. However, his writing is quite ambiguous, so it's not sure whether or not the word liberty is actually on the field of the flag or in the crescent of the flag. So there are two arguments which can be made based on where liberty might be located on this flag. And the first argument is made by David Hackett Fisher in his book, Liberty and Freedom. In his book, he believes that the word liberty was written directly on the field of the flag. And he cites, who most people I'm sure know, Preble, who stated in one of his books that the flag, the South Carolina flag, had liberty written on its field. And he also mentions that there are many early Revolutionary War flags which had mottos and words written directly on their field. But this is not the only argument. As Cordell L. Bragg makes in his book, Crescent Moon over Carolina, he disagrees with Fisher and Preble, and he instead believes that the flag had the word liberty written directly on its crescent instead. And he cites two main sources. They're both paintings, one of which does not have the word liberty on the flag, and the other one has the word liberty written in its crescent. And so, going into our purpose and research methodology, the purpose of our paper and this presentation was to try to determine whether or not the South Carolina Moultrie flag had the word liberty on it, and if it did, whether it was located in the crescent in the top corner or if it was located on the field instead. And we did this through two steps. In the first step, we looked at secondary sources and other authors and historians like Preble, who also mention this flag and talk about what their opinions are. And then in the second step, we looked at early documents and primary resources depicting the South Carolina flag to see if they differ or not. And as always, in any case of looking at historical flags, vexillological must be taken into account, which is having our own personal design thoughts on historical flags and using those as our opinions instead of primary sources. So first, we will go into some relevant publications.
Yeah, well, thank you, Zachary. Good to see this mic works. So our first publication here is Standards and Colors by Edward Richardson. So in this quote, you can see that Richardson states that several credible sources regarding the war say that the Fort Johnson flag does not have that motto of liberty, but the Fort Moultrie flag does. However, later Richardson states that Moultrie's memoirs, right, the man himself, the general, does not make any distinction between the flag at Fort Johnson versus the flag at Fort Moultrie. So that begs the question, was there a distinction? If it wasn't important enough to get, read so in his memoirs, is it actually relevant? And there's two possible things we can look into for that. The first is the fact that the letters may have been sewn on between the two battles, right? And this is very possible since the two battles took place a year apart. The second aspect is that Moultrie wrote these memoirs 20 years after the American Revolution. So it's very likely that a lot of the finer details escaped him, including maybe the letters on that flag. The second source we're looking into is Our Flag by the man himself, George Henry Preble. I'm sure you've all heard of him. He talks about, as Zachary said, matching the uniform colors and styles to the flag itself. It was very important to the committee planning the flag. And then again, he talks about the flag with blue and a white crescent, which was emblazoned liberty. And if we go to the next slide here, we see, this is Preble's drawings here. The first flag, Fort Johnson, and the second flag was at Fort Moultrie. Now, it's very important to understand that, as I'm sure all of you know, Preble was a northern vexillologist. So he didn't have as many direct ties to the region as some other sources and vexillologists we'll see here today. Preble, in fact, was the first person to introduce the concept of the word liberty being on the field of the flag. And there are several sources after Preble that reference this again and again and follow this sort of field of thought. But the original camp that supported this idea that liberty was on the field came from Preble's work.
Thank you, Owen. John Mullo is a historic uniform expert who states that South Carolina regiments wore a silver crescent with liberty inscribed into it. This is important because it establishes liberty as an important word at this time and also establishes that liberty was inscribed into artifacts during this time. That takes us into George Bancroft, who states that Moultrie had its own flag, the traditional blue background with the white crescent, but also that liberty was inscribed into the flag. However, his ambiguous statement that liberty was just inscribed into the flag raises concerns about the legitimacy of his claim that it was inscribed into the flag. This takes us into Terry Lipscomb, who very passionately believes that liberty was not written on the flag. He claims that any claim that liberty was written on the flag was just a northern reconstruction that lacked any historical or contemporary evidence. You can tell he's very passionate about this, but it's very important that his testimony is recognized because his expertise was specifically in the South Carolina Low Country during this time period, meaning that he spent more time looking into this, looked into more evidence, which makes his claim more legitimate. Now we will explore the contemporary depictions and look into the visual evidence behind if liberty was transcribed into the flag.
So the first two pieces that we're going to look at were painted by Lieutenant Henry Gray during the Battle of Sullivan's Island in 1776. He was a member of the 2nd Regiment of South Carolina and was wounded during the battle, and thus he was able to paint the scene as it happened. As you can see, he presented a very zoomed out view of the battle. However, upon closer analysis of the flag, we can see that there was no mention of the word liberty anywhere on the flag. While it's difficult to make out what's inside the crescent, you can see clearly that the field is blank. His next work, painted directly after the unsuccessful attack, is a similar zoomed out panoramic view, and the flag does not mention liberty anywhere on the flag. Now, this begs the question, as an American Revolutionary War soldier of the South Carolina side, it would seem important to to push the narrative of liberty, of fighting against the British and the oppressive tyranny. Thus, if the word liberty was indeed on the flag, it seems like this would be a key detail to include, especially if it was on the field, where it'd be more easily, added onto the painting. However, two things to keep in mind. Gray was wounded during the battle, and thus it might have been difficult for him to have a clear state of mind. And secondly, because the focal point of the battle was the whole view rather than a specific point of the flag, he may have omitted this detail in favor of other important aspects.
Thank you, Tarun. So this is a sketch of the fort by Thomas James, who is a British naval officer. This is the final version of his sketch. He sketched these versions over 3 days during and after the battle, and he did them from a ship in the bay, so not directly on the battlefield. So in this sketch, you can see that the crescent in the flag is a bit misshapen. It's a bit ill-defined, but it is there, and there is no mention of the word liberty. This is actually something that's slightly different from one of his earlier versions where the crescent is better defined. So you can see this earlier version here. The crescent is a bit better curved. It's clearer, but the scope is still as large as it was in the final sketch. It's still very difficult to see the flag in the actual sketch itself. It's likely that James was focusing more on the strategic aspects of the fort rather than the symbolic details like you would see in the flag. And that's probably why the detail of the crescent sort of eroded going into this final sketch. So this is an $8 note that was minted in South Carolina from 1776 to 1777. And the important part of this, as you can see in the lower left quadrant, is the battleship on the note, which has the crescent flag as its ensign and jack. And this was said to be a South Carolinian ship, as you can see from the flag. But Peter Anzoff, who I actually believe is present here today, argues that this was not a South Carolinian warship at all, because South Carolina did not have access to battleships of this caliber until the 1780s, which would be several years after this note was minted. So he argues that it's actually most likely a British warship, which would mean that the crescent flag was transplanted onto it to make it appear South Carolinian. So the importance of this, even if the ship is not South Carolinian, is that the flag was seen as an appropriate symbol of South Carolinian culture to make this ship appear Carolinian, important enough that it would appear on an official piece of currency minted by South Carolina. And as you can see in this version of the crescent flag, there is no inscription of the word liberty. This is a painting by Nicholas Pocock. It's in 1783, so 7 years after the battle. A little bit about Pocock. He was a British painter from mainland England. He was not thought to be present at the battle. So everything depicted in this painting is from secondhand sources of the battle. As you can see in the flag, which is not very clear in this graphic, there's no inscription of the word liberty. And this could be due to several reasons. First of all, it may be that liberty just wasn't on the flag, and that's why Pocock didn't include it. It could be that it was on the flag and the information didn't reach him because, again, he wasn't at the battle. It could also be that he intentionally excluded the word liberty, even if he knew it was there. Pocock probably did not want to legitimize the American cause any more than he had to. And he also wanted to focus on his battleships. He was well known for painting naval scenes, particularly naval battles such as this one. As you can see, the flag is not centered or in the focus of the painting. He may not have wanted to add extraneous detail that wasn't needed. So before we move on to our later depictions, I just want to point out a common theme in the earlier depictions, which is that the scope of the images tends to be very broad. They tend to be drawn or painted from farther away. And this means that if the word liberty was in the crescent of the flag, it may have been hard to show that in those depictions. But if the word liberty was on the field of the flag, it would have been much easier to show it, even in those very broad scopes. So the fact that it wasn't present in any of those primary sources is a strong indicator that the word liberty was probably not on the field of the flag. So this is the first of our later depictions. That Pocock painting was just 7 years after the war. This is 50 years after the war. It's painted by John Blake White, who was an American painter. His father was thought to be a veteran of the war, and he was family friends with Francis Marion, who was a legendary figure in South Carolina history. Both of those are depicted in the painting. As you can see, his flag is a bit more clear than in some of the earlier renditions, and there appears to be some lettering in the crescent. Once again, it's a bit unclear in this graphic, but we interpret that to be the word liberty. So a couple possibilities for why that might be. First of all, he may have heard from his father, from his family friends who were involved in the battle, that liberty was in the crescent, and so he included it in his painting. It also could be that because White had such personal ties to the battle, he wanted to accentuate its importance towards the American cause. He wanted to emphasize how important liberty was to the battle and to its moral values, and he put that in as more of an artistic touch.
Our next piece comes a little bit later, almost 70 years after the battle, and was painted by Johannes Ortel, who was a German clergyman in 1858. He actually moved to the United States only in 1849, so he had no direct connections to the battle. Similarly, he was commissioned by Martin Johnson and Co. to paint this for a court clerk's office in New York City. So this was increasingly removed from the battle. As you can see here, there is no mention of the word liberty either in the field of the flag or the crescent. Another important note to keep in mind is this was 14 years before Preble's initial description of the flag, where he claimed that liberty was on the field of the flag. Whereas if you remember from earlier, Lipscomb argued that argument was only a northern view of the flag. Whereas in this case, we can see that the northern view at the time must have been that liberty was nowhere on the flag, because a German clergyman who came over recently about 10 years before had that view. However, the same could be argued against that. He may have been working on false information, especially as he was so removed from the battle, especially the Moultrie memoirs, which were vague and did not mention the word liberty at all. So he may have based this simply, especially as this was a pretty minor work for him, to just say, go by those memoirs and say that the flag just was simply the crescent with the blue field. The next picture is even more removed, almost 100 years after the battle, and it appeared in a New York textbook, A School History of the United States, which was published by Harper Brothers, which was one of the biggest publishing companies in the United States at the time. There is no inclusion of the liberty anywhere on the flag, and this came after Preble's argument that liberty was on the flag, which was apparently a northern argument. So we can see here that both before and after Preble's argument, that the prevailing theory in the North at the time was that liberty was not appear anywhere on the flag. However, do keep in mind that due to the Civil War tensions, especially in the previous slide, the North may not have wanted to represent the South as ever fighting for liberty, especially, during the Reconstruction period. The same can be argued, though, because they had no direct connections to the battle, they may have been operating on incomplete information. Finally, we took a trip down to Fort Moultrie, the actual site of the battle, and in their exhibit, they portray the flag without any mention of the word liberty on the flag. Now, it seems like this would be a credible source because they had historians there that had direct ties to the battle, and it is the actual site of the battle. However, this exhibit was unsourced and uncredited, so it's impossible to verify the true accuracy of this rendition of the flag. Finally, we move into our conclusion. There was 3 possible conclusions that we decided we could make from these evidences. The first was that there was no inscription of the word liberty on the flag at all. And the second and third ones are, if liberty was on the flag, it could have been in the upper crescent of the flag. And finally, as Preble stated, liberty was inscribed on the field of the flag and not in the crescent.
So as to the first possibility, which we consider to be the most likely, it is that liberty was not inscribed on the flag at all, whether in the crescent or the field. Most of the sources that are most contemporary to the first portrayal of the flag seem to support this notion.
Another possibility is that the flag contained liberty, but it was written in the upper crescent. However, these accounts only started to come about 50 years after in paintings, and I'm pretty sure that Lipscomb would have called this a northern reconstruction.
And the final possibility is Preble's possibility, in that the word liberty was written on the field of the flag. This is also not too wild to assume, given that other Revolutionary War era flags had the word liberty emboldened on them as well.
So finally, for our ultimate conclusion on this topic, we believe that if you look at only the primary sources at this time, there was likely no liberty found on this flag. But if you did go off of William Henry Drayton's memoirs and believe that to be a very credible source, then we believe it is more likely liberty would be found within the crescent, as argued by Bragg and argued by other historians, as opposed to being on the field, as argued by Preble and by Fisher. And finally, we have a photo of the Gamecock Flag Association out front of Fort Moultrie, which we got to visit during our research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a couple of comments on a question. You've been so clear in your presentation of this. I'm delighted to have an answer to it that I can hang my hat on if I ever need to. And the two observations I'm going to sure speak for many people how thrilling it is to have a bunch of young people at this conference, more than we've ever had. Look at that photograph. We know this is largely a male field, but look at all the girls in it.
Did you look at the Citadel's big red battle flag, since it closely matches South Carolina's on whether they had that, or prove or disprove that?
We did look at the Citadel's big red flag, but that was made right before the outbreak of the Civil War, and so it was quite removed from this flag. And of course, it contained a palmetto, and so it would be considered more of a palmetto flag rather than a flag based on the early Revolutionary War design. Of course, for those of you who may not know, the palmetto was added in homage to the Battle of Fort Sullivan's Island, because the fort there, Fort Moultrie, was actually constructed out of palmetto wood, and it helped the cannonballs sort of absorb that blast. And so that's the reason why the palmetto was added. But this was not until the Civil War, so we did not consider flags like that. Thank you.
First, I wanted to reiterate, I thought it was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Well done. I also wondered, I've always wondered about the crescent on the South Carolina flag. In one of the paintings that you showed, it looks like a gorget, a piece of armor that was used up to the Napoleonic War era. You're nodding your head. Am I right about that? What is that crescent?
So this is actually another debate on the flag, whether it was a gorget or if it was a crescent. Because in Moultrie's memoirs, he states that it's fashioned from the uniforms of his troops. And a lot of the gorgets that his troops had actually inscribed the word liberty within it. So that's where the field of thought of if it was, on the flag, if the word liberty was on the flag, it'd be inside the crescent, because the field of thought is that would be a gorget that he modeled from a lot of troops. However, that's still, up in the air. It's not very clear if it is a crescent, if it is a gorget, but that is another debate of whether that crescent was a gorget that just, had liberty emblazoned on it, or if it's actually just a crescent.
If I could add a comment on the crescent discussion. There is another interpretation of the crescent, and that is that the word crescent at one time was an adjective, and it meant a crescent thing is a thing that's increasing. That's where words like increasing and crescendo and all that type of word came from. So you can kind of see an analogy there from a heraldic point of view, where we're increasing and we're getting better. And so that's just another interpretation. Who knows what the real one is.
Yeah.
Zach knows who I am.
So many questions. Let me just go down.
Thank you. Two points for future consideration. You might want to take a dive into the effect of the rise of large flag companies on the designs they offered for sale to the general public on flag design, because I think the Annan Flag Company was one of the first to offer this flag as a reproduction. Two, I think if you take a romp through Whitney's papers at the Briscoe Center, you'll find a file on this. And he based his interpretation on the cap badge. Because there are surviving cap badges in museums that are clearly inscribed. So, future paths for research.
Regarding the display in Fort Moultrie itself, you said it was uncredited and not footnoted. So what is your belief that it's not credited just because they didn't have any credits there at the display? Or did you get to speak to Park Service personnel about that specifically?
So we actually did ask well, actually, when we went to the park, it was closed, I believe. So there was no one there. However, we did find sources online where it said they did ask park personnel at the site, and they believe that there's no liberty on the flag, and that's why their exhibit does not have liberty on the flag. When we met uncredited, we met it was not sourced at the site, so there was no way we could easily verify like who the historian was that put it together or where it came from. But we definitely believe that they have, a basis for that representation.
Don't accept that as an answer, because any given person at the Park Service might tell you that,
Yeah.
they just don't know. But they have voluminous reports on like desks and everything they have. And I'll talk to you about that later.
Thank you.
Great presentation. I was wondering, I may not have picked up on it, but are there any extant original flags to be able to tell? I would think under close examination, that might go a long way towards resolving the issue, if there are any extant from that period of time.
We looked in one of the earlier sources that we spoke about. It was a compilation of South Carolinian Revolutionary War flags, and in almost every single one, it said this did not survive or it went missing. As is with most Revolutionary War flags, I think there's only 5 Revolutionary War flags from the South that are still surviving. One of them was just recently discovered, the one in Spartanburg. I'm sure some of you guys saw that, but for some reason, Southern flags during the Revolutionary War just went missing or were destroyed during the battle.
I'm sure y'all saw in some of the paintings how torn that flag was. So it might just have been destroyed during a battle.
Thank you.
I have a comment. You may be interested in knowing that there's a town in East Texas named Jasper, and I think it was named for the sergeant. I'll have to look that up when I get back home. And also, I wondered if you'd done any research on naval flags of South Carolina during the Revolution. One of them was supposed to have had 13 horizontal stripes of red and blue with a rattlesnake and the famous motto, "Don't tread on me."
Yes, we did see that early in our research. The only example of a crescent flag or a Moultrie flag of that design being used on a ship was the one that Will spoke about so well with the dollar bill. But we did see in one of Benjamin Franklin's early letters him describing, I believe it was to an ambassador in Italy, he described that flag, but that was the only flag that we found naval-wise which had a design featuring a crescent or gorget on it in its corner.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you guys.